Hello, I'm Julia Baird. The 2025 Boyer Lectures are dedicated to the idea of the radical experiment of Australian democracy. Today's lecturer, John Anderson, is a former Deputy Prime Minister and a sixth-generation farmer and grazier. His lecture is about a civilizational moment for Australia, and he'll argue that we need to look not just at the institutions of democracy, but its very spirit.
I very much appreciate the ABC for allowing me to give this speech entitled Our Civilizational Moment. The English-American author Os Guinness speaks of civilizational moments, the point every civilization reaches where they begin to stagnate. They must either rediscover and rejuvenate the ideals and virtues that made them flourish, replace those ideals and virtues with equally effective ones, or decline and die off. The Western democratic world now stands at one of those moments. Since 1945, when an exhausted but sobered and triumphant alliance of democracies emerged from the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust, we have known what has often been called the liberal world order. The architects of the post-war settlement committed themselves with almost sacred resolve to construct a world where such horrors could not recur. For all its failings, that post-1945 liberal world order, led by America, delivered unprecedented peace and prosperity. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union's subsequent disintegration appeared to ratify everything the West had championed. Liberal democracy and market economies had not merely survived ideological competition, they had triumphed absolutely. History itself, proclaimed some of our most confident voices, had reached its terminus in favour of Western democracy. But today, democracy is in retreat. The evidence is stark and undeniable. Freedom House recorded a 19th straight year of global freedom decline in 2024, with political rights and civil liberties deteriorating in 60 countries while improving in only 34. Election-related violence occurred in 27 of the 66 countries that held national votes. The Economist Intelligence Unit puts the 2024 Global Democracy score at its lowest level since the index began in 2006, with only about 45% of people living in some form of democracy, while 39% live under authoritarian rule. The liberal global order that has defined our age is coming to an end. And it is not only because of external threats, but also because of our own neglect. We have been complicit in the rise of our opponents through reactive short-term policy and a loss of belief in ourselves. Despite being among the wealthiest societies the world has ever seen, we have answered the cost of living crisis with policies that promise relief today while sending utterly unconscionable bills to our children and our grandchildren. Culturally, we have emphasised the things that divide rather than unite us, weakening our social compact and leaving us vulnerable to adversaries of great conviction. Authoritarian powers have seen our self-doubt as an opportunity and are exploiting it with glee. New York columnist David Brooks saw this clearly when he warned, "We don't only have to worry about the people tearing down democracy, we have to worry about who's building it up." The 21st century, Brooks writes, has become a dark century because the seedbeds of democracy have been neglected. For democracy to function, you have to till and fertilise the soil, erect fences, pull up weeds, prune the early growth. It takes a lot of cultivation to make democracy work. This is a global reckoning, and Australia cannot escape it. What happens to us is inextricably linked to what happens to the global democratic order. So let us take a closer look at our Australian democracy. Sir Robert Menzies, our longest-serving Prime Minister, said, "Of us Australian people it will be written, they were born Democrats. As Democrats, they died." He said this in the middle of the Second World War, and even though democracy's future in Europe was in serious doubt, its future in Australia, for Menzies at least, remains certain. Menzies was not the first to say that democracy and Australian identity were inextricably linked. After visiting Sydney in the 1820s, Edward Gibbon Wakefield wrote in 1829 that the democratic spirit will surely exist here. Within 3 decades, the 3 largest colonies, South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, had adopted near universal male suffrage for their lower houses. Because these franchises applied to male British subjects, Aboriginal men were in law eligible to vote, though participation was admittedly low. It was an imperfect but meaningful expansion of the franchise in the mid-19th century. And in 1894, women in South Australia won the right to vote and to stand for Parliament, and in 1902 the Commonwealth extended both rights to federal elections, making Australia only the 2nd country to legislate national women's suffrage. Our democracy remained imperfect. That same year, the Commonwealth Franchise Act explicitly excluded Aboriginal Australians from the federal roll, except those already enrolled to vote in a state. Yet, even so, by global standards, we were amongst the most democratic polities of the time. 80 years on from his prediction, Wakefield had been proven right. Another 120 years later, though, how fares Australian democracy today? By conventional metrics, perhaps, quite well. The Economist's latest Democracy Index places Australia 11th amongst 167 nations. Yet, as Menzies warned in his broadcast essays of 1942, we must distinguish between the machinery of democracy and its spirit. Our electoral process and the structure of our government are the machinery of our democracy, visible, measurable mechanisms that we can audit and fine-tune. But, as Menzies argued, it is the spirit of democracy, though more elusive and resistant to measurement, which forms its vital essence. Australia's democratic machinery continues to function, but how is its spirit faring? Well, plainly, trust sits at the heart of healthy democratic spirit. It is the precondition for cooperation and for recognising the interests we hold in common so that we can take them forward together. Low trust democracies do not long prosper. It is therefore deeply concerning that levels of trust in our key institutions, our democratic institutions, are at a historic low. In the Scanlon Institute's most recent national survey, only 33% of Australians trust the federal government all or most of the time, down 7% from when the survey was first conducted in 2007. The figure is 34% for state governments. This means that 2/3 of Australians don't trust their legislators most of the time. Perhaps a natural consequence of all of this is that other than participating in compulsory voting, younger Australians appear to be disengaging from politics, especially millennials in their 30s and 40s. Distrust and disengagement are recent companions to our long-standing vice and perhaps the gravest threat of all to our democratic spirit, complacency. This vice seems as quintessentially Australian as the virtues we cherish: our rejection of hierarchy, our easygoing irreverence, our refusal to take ourselves too seriously. And perhaps complacency is the inevitable shadow these virtues cast, the lurking danger within our national strengths. We think of ourselves as the lucky country, having long forgotten that Donald Horne meant it as a warning, not a boast. We are largely uninterested in the careful thought, planning and sacrifice that created our political, economic and legislative institutions. The depth of thought and care that animated the Federation debates and conventions of the 1890s, ultimately producing our Constitution, is astonishing. Yet most Australians would have only the vaguest notion of who Henry Parkes, Edmund Barton or Alfred Deakin were. It's as though our peace and prosperity simply fell from the sky, and we no longer respect, let alone emulate, the giants on whose shoulders we stand. Our perceived luck gives us a false sense of security, as though no matter what changes take place in the world, no matter what new challenges arise nationally and internationally, she'll be right, mate. But history tells a very different story of the rise and fall of nations and civilisations. Luck runs out. Take national defence. She'll be right seems to have become our national defence policy. Despite pleas from a unity ticket of our leading defence strategies and our most powerful ally, the United States, we still refuse to lift defence spending to even 3% of GDP. All the while, our government tells us that we are living in the most dangerous times since the Second World War. The contrast between Australia's attitude to defence today and the years leading up to the Great War, when we were just a young nation of around 5 million people, could not be greater. Under legislation introduced by 1909 by Alfred Deakin and passed in 1911 under the Fisher Labor government, compulsory military training for Australian males from age 12 to 26 became part of Australian life. In 1909 and 1910, we placed orders with British shipyards for a battle cruiser with supporting light cruisers and destroyers and 2 E-class submarines, building an Australian Navy powerful enough to secure our homeland from the formidable German East Asia Squadron. Importantly, historian Geoffrey Blaney points out that left-wing as well as right-wing politicians strongly supported this emphasis on an armed Australia. Compare that with the situation today. Amazingly, as a trading island nation, we have no resources to minesweep our ports, to protect our shipping from enemy mines. Similarly, we have no ballistic missile defence, no way of shooting down missiles targeting Australia's critical infrastructure, let alone our population. All of these capabilities have been cut from our national budget. Our current onshore fuel reserves in a time of crisis would last only around 3 weeks. Beyond that, we would struggle to keep the country fed and moving or to deliver vital goods to Australians in a time of emergency or war. How could we go to America with a straight face asking for military aid, asking Americans to potentially sacrifice their daughters and sons and gold for us, we who barely take our own security seriously? Housing has been another area of decades-long public policy complacency. In an essay titled "Welcome to the End of Democracy," American demographer Joel Kotkin singles out Australia in particular for once being uniquely egalitarian in terms of home and land ownership. But now, Kotkin reports, things have changed. Australia is returning to the old world of home ownership as a privilege of the wealthy. Home ownership is part of the egalitarian uniqueness of Australia, as opposed to Europe of the 18th and 19th centuries, where land was mostly locked up among wealthy elites. There was no greater testimony of Australian equality than the fact that convicts were given a minimum of 30 acres of land upon emancipation. The decline in home ownership is particularly apparent among young people, interestingly mirroring their political disengagement. For those aged 25 to 34, home ownership extraordinarily has decreased from 61% in 1981 to 43% at the time of our last national consensus in 2021. It would be comforting for us older Australians to attribute this to a generational penchant for gap years and smashed avocado breakfasts, but in truth, it is a dangerous public policy failure. There have been other canary in the coal mine episodes in recent years, episodes that have revealed our deep complacency and failure to grasp the stakes of our current moment within the broader sweep of history. One was our collective failure to reckon with the new economic reality following the global financial crisis and to make the short-term sacrifices needed to reduce the national debt burden borne by future generations. This was particularly evident in the collapse of the 2014 budget attempt at a federal level at meaningful structural reform. Since then, there's been no serious constituency for sound economic management in this country. Plainly, we are at risk of baking in the very real decline in our living standards that we're now witnessing. And I genuinely feel that we are in structural decline. I'm furthermore staggered by our reluctance to learn the lessons from history and from other countries. How can we ignore the lessons emerging right now from countries like France, the United Kingdom and Germany? We see a government in France collapsing, chaos, because it cannot manage its financial affairs, and German Chancellor Merz has warned that the economic powerhouse of Europe can no longer afford its welfare state. Some might say that Australia's debt to GDP ratio is still much healthier than those countries, but this is to ignore the reality that it is now fast approaching the level at which those countries lost control of their national finances. Our naivety about national debt has been matched by a short-sighted disregard for civil liberties. One aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns was the emergence of a sense that essential freedoms were gifts to be bestowed by government rather than rights inherent to we the people. It revealed a troubling nonchalance about the principles of civil liberty that was so hard won in the history of Western liberal democracy and which should not be lightly discarded. We seem to forget that a vital task of democratic government is in fact to restrain its own powers, even if they appear to be against their own interests, at times of difficulty notwithstanding. Trust and complacency are the two concepts I now come back to. Sadly, it seems to me that we are losing trust not only in one another and in the institutions of freedom that our forefathers bequeathed to us, but most alarming in the very beliefs and values that gave rise to those institutions in the first place. Perhaps the great American economic historian Thomas Sowell put it best when he reminded us, civilization doesn't sustain itself. It has to be built, maintained, defended, and most importantly, understood. When that understanding is lost, decline is not just likely, it becomes inevitable. And that's the illusion we're living under today, that civilization is permanent, but it isn't. It is rented, and every generation must pay the rent. Right now, we're skipping payments, and the landlord always shows up eventually. I do not pretend to have the expertise to offer remedies to all of the public policy challenges that now confront us. But when it comes to regenerating Australia's democratic spirit, any solution must include relearning our national story. According to the Australian Government's Trust in Democracy survey, less than half of Australians have received some form of civic education. And all too often when young Australians are taught about their country and heritage, it is following a curriculum that has a disproportionate focus on historical injustices rather than presenting the full complexity and richness of our Australian story. We demean ourselves when we forget or decry those who did so much to establish and indeed defend the principles of freedom and opportunity that we take for granted in this country. There is a better story of Australia, one that includes the injustices that we might learn from them, but also shows that seeds of hope were already being planted at an early stage. The first governor of the colony, Arthur Phillip, made it clear the year before the establishment of the convict settlement at Botany Bay that there can be no slavery in a free land and consequently no slaves. Now, practice did not always match principle. Across the 19th century, blackbirding into Queensland's sugar industry, for example, brought tens of thousands of Pacific Islanders, many through coercion or kidnapping. Wages were withheld, families were separated, and later many were deported under the Pacific Islanders Labourers Act of 1901. And it is undoubtedly true that Indigenous Australians faced brutal injustice, too often at the hands of too many. The horrific case of the Mile Creek Massacre in the electorate that I once represented, to take just one example, was an outrageous barbarity that offends to the very core our fundamental belief in the worth and dignity of every individual. The legal process that followed Mile Creek represented both the best and the worst of Australia at that time. There were the brave men and women who ensured that the perpetrators were arrested. Then there was the jury at the first trial who shamefully acquitted the perpetrators on a legal technicality in less than 20 minutes. And one of the jurors was quoted as saying, "I would never see a white man hanged for killing a black." On the other hand, there was the heroism of Attorney General John Plunkett. Outraged at this blatant miscarriage of justice, he forced a retrial. And in that second trial, 7 men were found guilty of murder and hanged. The better angels from within had prevailed in our legal system. And finally, some of the justice that had been promised to Indigenous people was being crystallised. Yet there are other important stories we need to tell about Indigenous people in this country. I find the extraordinary story of Indigenous woman Maria Yalamundi, Maria Locke as she became, deeply moving. Maria's father, the Darug leader Yarramundi, and Lachlan Macquarie, the then governor, became good friends. And they agreed that Maria would study at Governor Macquarie's Parramatta Native Institution. In 1819, Maria stunned the colony by taking first prize in the public examinations, beating almost 100 non-Indigenous children. 5 years later, she married a convict carpenter, Robert Locke. She had 10 children and eventually acquired significant property and business interests in her own name, starting quite the family dynasty. Stories like hers give us a fuller sense of the richness and complexity of our national story, in which there is so much to grieve and so much to be proud of. As we relearn our national story, we must also re-establish the importance of personal character in public leadership and civility in our public discourse. Our public leaders are not just architects of our policies and stewards of our national story. They are also, in their personal character, representatives of our deepest values and role models for our children. I believe we would all do well to ensure that we do our level best not to give offence and then redouble our efforts not to take offence. We need to refrain from inflamed accusations of treason or betrayal towards those who think differently. We need to break the re-emergence of this vicious cycle that history tells us has so frequently resulted in misery. We are, after all, proud inheritors of the tradition of His Majesty's loyal opposition, where profound disagreement is expected, even encouraged, without questioning one another's decency or loyalty. The antidote to the coarseness of our current debate, to name-calling and vitriol, is surely to display such civility that those on the other side of the table are compelled to debate the substance of the issues. With the current President of the United States being the man that he is, perhaps now is a very good time indeed for other leaders in the Western world to counterbalance that influence with old-fashioned values of civility, integrity and humility. Renewal of our democratic spirit requires leadership of such character. And perhaps most of all, it requires of us the humility to avoid what has been called chronological snobbery. For if we now see some things more clearly than our forebears, we should expect our children to see some things more clearly than us. As C.S. Lewis put it, every age has its own outlook. It's especially good at seeing certain truths and especially liable to making certain mistakes. Menzies, who, it must be remembered, was a true intellectual, reminded us that democracy is far more than the tallying of votes. It is a spiritual conviction which, for him, was rooted in the Christian conception that there is in every human soul a spark of the divine. Similarly, the great Australian historian Manning Clark, while not professing quite the same Christian convictions as Menzies, reflected nonetheless on the deep cultural and spiritual underpinnings of our democracy. He feared that Australia could become a kingdom of nothingness, focused only on short-term material comfort and superficial progress, neglecting deeper cultural and spiritual development to its own demise. I share that concern. Without a deep democratic spirit, democracy is a hollow ritual, ready to be blown over by the next strong wind. I do, however, remain profoundly hopeful. In recent years, I've stumbled into the podcasting world, which has brought me unexpectedly into contact with many of our younger generations in this country. And what I'm seeing in many of these young people is very impressive. Their thoughtfulness, their longing for a restoration of purpose and direction inspire me. I'm convinced that many of them can and will, with the right encouragement, rise to meet the challenge of leadership. And our earthly hope surely rests with them. And to my fellow elder Australians, I make this plea: let us neither exasperate nor demoralise the next generations, even when we feel misunderstood by them. Let us encourage them, equip them, stand beside them as they carry Australia's democratic spirit forward into whatever struggles and opportunities lie ahead. The future of democracy, both globally and in Australia, surely depends on it.
And that was John Anderson, former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. Now, if you'd like to see any other Boyer lectures, you can just go to ABC iView. I'm Julia Baird. Thanks so much for your company.